It isn't that Russia isn't a threat. It isn't that Iran isn't a threat. It's that China is the greatest adversary in the history of this country. And I'm very optimistic about the future, that God forbid we ever have to get into another world war, or God forbid anytime soon we have to be in a military conflict with China, that we're going to be prepared to do that, not just because of the policy, but very importantly, because you can sustain the popular will for a righteous war if you've not been engaged in unrighteous war.
Wow, I really like that twangy Texas music. Hi, welcome to the Kevin Roberts Show. I'm Larry O'Connor, and we've spent quite a few episodes now looking inward at America, our founding, and what America stands for, what she started as, and what she should become in the future. Well, how about we look outward a little bit? We're looking at America's foreign policy, how we project ourselves to the world. Let me quote a very sage, wise man who said that conservatives need a fresh vision for how America leads, one rooted in strength, restraint, and purpose. Oh, that's Kevin Roberts who said that. Kevin, what does America's foreign policy look like in the golden age?
Well, first and foremost, here at Heritage, we call that national security, which is kind of an answer to your question.
So you're already correcting me here. I'm doing my Henry Kissinger, Fadin Padesi. Isn't that how you're supposed to do it?
Yeah, apparently. I'm not going to try to mimic him or you. Whether you call it foreign policy or national security, ultimately the point is the same, and that is the very reason that the United States has a Department of State and a Department of War is to protect the homeland from foreign invaders. And what's happened over the last 100 years is that the United States, of course, has become a superpower. We have been virtuous many times in exercising that power, but we've also been the opposite a couple of times. And so what we're trying to do, and we'll talk about in this episode, no doubt, is just right size the American restraint, if you will. We need to have a very lethal military. We need to have a very energetic Department of State, but we don't need to have adventures around the world. We need to be very restrained so that when it happens that America's threatened, we're prepared for it.
So how do we find that sweet spot? Because I think within the conservative movement, you've got a lot of voices who say that we should be projecting American power, which will eventually project American values and principles to other countries. And that seems like a reasonable thing to do, and almost seems like it's in the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt or maybe some other prior Republican presidents. But there's others who would, be labeled isolationist, who don't want to have anything to do with the outside world and not have any interaction with foreign countries because we got to clean up shop at home. So how do you figure out where to find the happy middle? Or is there a happy middle?
Well, we think there's a happy middle. In fact, I think Heritage occupies that happy middle. And it's happy because ultimately, it's very historically accurate. That's where the United States has tended to be in its history. But ultimately, to your great question about projecting power, yeah, we want to project power. We want the world to know that when you engage the United States militarily, that you're going to confront the most lethal, the most efficient fighting force in the history of the world. But in order to do that in a republic, in order to have that kind of force, you have to sustain popular will for projecting that power, which means, ironically, but we've learned this in history, one of the ways to undermine that power is to use that force, that military force, too often for adventures that maybe Congress doesn't even act on with a declaration of war. And so what we're saying at Heritage, going back to this point about being in the middle, is let's project that power, but let's do so in a way, as Teddy Roosevelt said, to speak softly, but carry a big stick.
Yeah.
And I think that Donald Trump is very much in that vein.
Progressives and others would accuse America first to mean isolationist, right? Yet at the same time, I hear some voices on the right who sound pretty isolationist when they say America first. Is America first an isolationist slogan?
Well, there are definitely a couple of policymakers on the right who are isolationists, best as I can tell. And one of the problems with the phrase America first in its historical setting is that it is associated in the 1930s and 40s with isolationism. The great thing about using America first now is that it means something different. It means, first and foremost, we see policymaking, especially national security policymaking, through the lens of what's best for ordinary Americans. But secondly, it is that we're neither isolationist nor neoconservative adventurists, that in fact we're properly American, fighting on behalf of Americans when we need to, maybe occasionally on behalf of allies, if in fact the interest of the ally is our interest as Americans.
Well, so, okay, America's interest, that's important because as an American, I hate seeing suffering. I know you do too. The president talks about it all the time. He hates to see it when children are suffering and when there's war. So isn't it in America's interest to stop those horrible things from happening at the hands of an authoritarian overseas?
It might be. The key thing to remember is that it isn't always the case that it's in America's interest to do that directly. That is to say, use the example of Ukraine. It's in America's interest that Russia be weak, that Russia not invade other countries because of our history with Russia as an enemy. It doesn't mean necessarily that the United States has to be the majority funder of Ukraine's defense, right? Reasonable people can have differences of opinion on that, including on the right. But what we're trying to say at Heritage and an increasing number of organizations and places is that we no longer have the ability, even if we wanted to be the world's policeman in situations that you hypothesize about, because of a nearly $40 trillion national debt, that you've got to prioritize these things. And I guess just the last thing I'll say, if I can, is having that conversation doesn't mean that you're isolationist. Actually, having that conversation if you think about the historical context, will prevent the United States from being isolationist. In other words, if you don't address these problems and understand the trade-offs, there's going to be a strain of isolationism that grows because of the skepticism about the whole project of projecting that power.
You're breeding isolationists.
You are.
If you start venturing out without a clear plan and a clear interest for our country. I get that. That makes sense. All right. But if you're forward thinking, and I know you are, China, they don't seem to worry about projecting their power overseas. And you see them involved in countries in Africa and in our backyard. They're all over the Caribbean. What's China doing in the Caribbean? Building, cricket stadiums and building highways for them. They seem to be projecting their power. Can we afford to let China have an upper hand there?
No, we can't. And one of the benefits of having a more restrained prioritizing national security or foreign policy is being able to confront those main adversaries when they emerge. And I think one of the fruits of this national security reset that Heritage has led in Washington, for example, is being able to get more attention by policymakers on China. It isn't that Russia isn't a threat. It isn't that Iran isn't a threat. It's that China is the greatest adversary in the history of this country. Why? Because of the examples you mentioned. It isn't just their military power. My colleague Brent Sadler, who's a naval warfare expert, is just apoplectic about the gap in submarine production, for example, between the United States and China. It's the economic power. It's the Belt and Road Initiative. It is being very intentionally for the CCP in the backyard of America, in Latin America. Maybe we can come back to this in a little while, Larry. In a recent trip that I and some of my colleagues took to Latin America early 2025, we were prepared to see evidence in terms of structures, buildings, and conversations with political leaders about the influence of the CCP, but it was worse than we thought. And we've allowed that to happen because we were told that when the Cold War came to an end, it was the end of history.
Yeah, that's it.
We won.
Yeah, we're the dominant superpower. And look what happened. Look what happened. All right, so let's have a historical lesson here. It's my favorite.
Sure.
My favorite part of our show is when you get to teach us about history. But if you're projecting forward and saying what our national security policies should be in the future, holding on to an America First ideal and making sure that our interests are respected and accounted for in whatever foreign entanglements, let's say, borrowed from Washington. When you look backwards, if you look in history, when did we have that sweet spot? Is there a time in our history right now that you look back on and say, yeah, that's right about where we should be in terms of our foreign relationships?
The good news is, as I think about it, a majority of our history, the United States has been in that sweet spot or close to.
Mm-hmm.
From our founding, I would say all the way until the late 1800s, which is the first time we got to be part of the imperialist project. We need to right-size that, obviously. But then even between the two world wars, sometimes some historians will say that was an isolationist period in the United States. That's not exactly true. It's not fundamentally untrue. There were some members of the House and Senate in D.C. who were isolationists, but they were not a majority of them. We became more restrained. Why? Because of economic trouble. That's really a sweet spot. And the reason I really like that era as an example of this is the United States, when it finally needed to protect interests after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but also the very aligned interests of our allies, especially starting with the British, was able to ramp up its wartime production because it hadn't been spending money uselessly on other things. If the United States can use that era as an example here in the 2020s, then I'm very optimistic about the future, that God forbid we ever have to get into another world war, or God forbid anytime soon we have to be in a military conflict with China, that we're going to be prepared to do that. Not just because of the policy, but very importantly, because you can sustain the popular will for a righteous war if you've not been engaged in unrighteous war.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I mentioned foreign entanglements because I get into debates. I'm not an isolationist type. I'm very much, I feel like I'm a Reagan Republican. And Reagan recognized that we needed to project our strength at times around the world. The isolationists that I debate with, they always throw Washington's words back at me. George Washington said, beware foreign entanglements. Is that something that should be always held sort of as the measure of our national security foreign endeavors? Or was it very specific to that time? I mean, there was a war between Britain and France. People tried to drag America into it. Washington, was it very specific, or is it something that's sort of a larger doctrine?
Man, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. I'm going to say both.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, but to a nod to you, it's very specific about how concerned Washington was about the entanglements of half of his cabinet.
He was talking to John Adams.
Right.
He was saying, Adams, don't do what the Hamilton wants you to do. Or whatever.
Exactly. And then also concerned about how much Jefferson loved the French. And Washington saying, come on, guys, we just fought a war of independence. And so while it was specific to that, and we need to remember that, I think there's at least a little bit of ability for us to transfer that to the 21st century, not just because he's the father of our country, but also because there's wisdom in that. That doesn't mean that we don't have alliances, but for example, let's take Trump's revitalization of NATO. Trump's critique of NATO wasn't initially that it shouldn't exist. It was that the other parties, the other countries, weren't pulling their weight. They, with all but a couple of exceptions, every NATO member country was spending a lower percentage of its GDP on defense than the United States. And Trump's point was, he didn't use this language, but you could almost hear Washington making this complaint. We're willing to be in an alliance with you because of shared interests, but this begins to become an entanglement if we're the ones who are financing your defense so that you can grow your welfare state. I think if I were to update Washington's words to be applied today, I might say America first. I actually think that's sort of what Washington was getting at.
Yeah. So some people will then hear your words right there and say, okay, yeah, I get that, but we're in a post 9/11 world. And after 9/11, that was a wake-up call for this country. It was a wake-up call for the conservative movement that we can no longer just be America first and just focus on what's going on in our shores and maybe a couple of alliances in Europe, because we're a target. People want to destroy us, so we need to be proactive and engaged. Are they wrong about that?
They are now. 9/11 was 25 years ago. The United States was 100% right in taking on the Taliban as a military unit in Afghanistan. We learned both in Afghanistan and in Iraq thereafter, as you know, that it's foolhardy for the United States to think that it can somehow go implant democracy, Western style, in any other culture, but a particular culture that isn't Western. It doesn't mean that they're lesser than us, but they're very different. And to learn that lesson, just with humility as a people, as a nation state, is good in understanding that if you want to be influential around the world, you have to know where and when and how to actually project that power. It doesn't always have to be with the American military. And yes, there are still Islamist threats to the United States. We have them domestically, not Muslims themselves, but Islamist threats, the political project of imposing Islam on all of us. And I think that's a much greater threat, socially and culturally, that is this domestic threat, than worrying about the Islamist threat around the world. Our allies need to pull their weight in doing that as well.
I remember in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president, one of his big applause lines was, we're spending all this money and energy and blood and treasure building hospitals and roads in Afghanistan, and we're not building hospital and roads here. And as vacuous as that is, it actually resonated with a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, it did. And while the framing of that is overly simplified to state the
What,
obvious.
from Barack Obama? No.
Yes, yeah, I know. This is really hard to accept. The kernel of truth there, which I think conservatives would do a much better job of explaining than Obama, is that since that time, we've more than doubled our national debt. And it isn't that you can't do both. You can, of course, be involved around the world and also attend to your domestic matters. It's just that we're going to lose the ability to project that power around the world if we don't do a better job, first and foremost, of getting our financial house in order in Washington.
Yeah. So we're Cold War kids, you
We
and
are.
I, and so we were
I
sort of.
thought you were an old guy.
Yeah. Well, I ran a marathon recently.
Yeah, you've one-upped me. I'm not going to try to match you on that.
My foreign policy, I'm guessing from hearing you speak and reading so much of what you've written, a lot of your I keep saying foreign policy, national security, your outlook overseas as an American, shaped by that Reagan.
Oh, very much so.
Shaped by
More
the
than
Cold War.
anyone else.
It's hard not to have that sort of be so formative that it's hard to then think outside of that. Tell me about your journey with regard to America's position in the world and how you've evolved from that era, or maybe grown is a better word than evolved.
Yeah, I definitely have grown, as I think a lot of conservatives have, but two important chapters in that journey. First is the one that you mentioned, Reagan. I mean, just totally formative for people our age, right? And rightly, he was right. He was good.
Yeah.
Heritage, of course, was a really important partner in that, and we're all proud of those things. The second, though, was the era we were just talking about, and that's post 9/11. And it was in that era that I referred to myself as a neoconservative, certainly a neoconservative as it related to some of the critique of the social safety net system, the domestic side of that, which is good. But on the national security side, I would argue with my colleagues at the university where I was teaching that President Bush was right for invading Iraq, George W. Bush, that regime change was right. We could implant democracy. And you know what? Over the next 10 years, I realized how wrong I was. And while I still want to assign the best motives to our policymakers, including President George W. Bush, I realized that I had been wrong and actually had kind of been a jerk about it to some of my colleagues. And so I hadn't really thought too much about why my thoughts on national security would be important until I became the president of the Heritage Foundation 4 years ago. And when the Ukraine thing occurred, I kept rejecting the false dichotomy that is so common in Washington, which is you either give $260 billion to Ukraine or you're an isolationist who loves Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And our point at Heritage over the last few years is if Reagan were here, he would say that's hogwash.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of continuity there. Actually.
You took a lot of flack for that too, by the way, but you're still standing.
I am, and actually it was worth it.
Okay, yeah. So one interesting perspective on this, I think, it comes from the World War II era as well, because the people who formed us, foreign policy-wise, like Ronald Reagan, they came from that World War II era. That helped form them. So now projecting forward, you talk to a lot of young conservatives, high school, college, in their 20s. What do you hear from them when they're challenging where we stand right now in the world?
Well, one thing that's really good for us as Generation Xers to hear, Reagan guys who are very open to the new critiques, but also one thing that's challenging. The good thing is there needs to be more transparency and authenticity in policymaking about what America's strategy is. And
so there's distrust right now,
yeah,
I think, from people. We say, hey, we got to go do this thing. We got to spend this money. And oh, by the way, you're going to be wearing the uniform and taking the gun over there to fight that fight. They don't trust us.
No, and that's ultimately the lesson they've drawn from the Bush years, right? And that's very difficult for us to overcome unless we're willing to have those conversations with those who offer that critique. The thing that I chide them for, and I do so as a friend of them, is they don't really know enough history about the Reagan years, for that matter, enough about Washington's administration, Hamilton's beliefs on this. And I mean, that's fairly common when we're younger. We're not as well read as we are when we're older. And so I offer that fraternally, not, the old guy wagging his finger. Yeah. But I think if we take both the critique and their need to bone up on some of this history, and we invite them into this more restrained, prioritizing national security movement, that's the right attitude, rather than condemning, rather than saying, oh, we're going to draw a red line here, and because you said that about Reagan, you can never be part of it.
Right, yeah.
That that ultimately is really fatal politically. It's also not what we're called to do. We're trying to add and multiply, right?
Yeah. We're here in Washington, so
Oh,
we can't walk down. I know. I apologize for that. We can't walk down the street without being surrounded by some kind of inspiring monument or building or memorial about America's greatness and how we've been able to project our power and our peace and our values overseas. But you also travel the country. It's not exclusive to Washington. Is there a place in this country that really resonates with you in terms of what we mean to the world, what America means to the world?
Man, that is such a hard question, and I figured that you might ask something along those lines.
Isn't it the statue and the poem at the bottom? Jim Acosta loves that poem.
Well, yeah. It's going to be so hard for me to identify one. I mean, part of me wants to say Normandy, and I know that that's overseas, but if you think about an excellent example of the righteous use of American military power. Yeah. Of course, that is an example, but I will
fair that's you know what that's sort of American soil if you think about.
Yeah, well, it is,
considering it was watered with so much American blood, and they fly the American flag there. So
that's true. But I'll give you an American.
All right,
location.
What do you got?
Yorktown.
Oh yeah,
it's underappreciated because people, and rightly, are really interested in the history of World War II. Mm-hmm. We have people interested in the Civil War, but hopefully America's 250th anniversary will revitalize tourism to all of these places, but particularly the revolutionary sites. And the great thing about visiting Yorktown is a lot of the battlefield is still very well preserved, but it makes you realize Americans had no business winning that war, but that by virtue of winning that war, we were going to, as Washington promised, keep liberty and order in balance. And that means for the domestic project of self-governance in the United States, our power that we're projecting has to be really legitimate and righteous. And in those times when we violated that, we actually undermined the domestic project.
Yeah, Yorktown, I wasn't expecting Yorktown, but you're right. That is a great battlefield. Speaking of Hamilton, by the way, you can run the route that Hamilton ran. He should have been killed.
Yeah, he's
basically given what he was doing that day. All right, so let's talk about the Hawks for a minute. Heritage, Heritage used to be referred to as Hawks all the time. Never saw a war that you didn't want to get involved in and send troops to. And
it was common in that era. Right?
There are still Hawks in this town, in Washington, in America. They're still sort of hanging on to this idea that we always constantly have to be projecting our power. We saw it in the Republican primaries this last go-around. How do we temper that sort of instinct that I think is still sort of part of the DNA of the conservative movement? Because you hear it and it's like, yeah, that's right. Oh, no, wait, maybe it's not right. That's the struggle, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, our approach at Heritage has been to recognize that there was an era when being a Hawk was right. Being a Hawk was right during the Soviet years. At Heritage, we are perhaps the biggest Hawks in this town and in this country toward the Chinese Communist Party. Our point to the Hawks, who are sort of categorical Hawks, particularly 3 or 4 members of the Senate who are Republicans, is to focus on the facts and the reality rather than the desire to make it personal, even though sometimes Heritage takes a lot of arrows for this. And what we're saying is, let's just posit that you're right. You can't afford to go to all of those wars. You can't afford to go to all of those places. And so therefore we must prioritize. But just to go to one more level of specificity, we also have to make sure that when we're looking at our military spending, we're spending on those programs, those munitions that actually are for the next war rather than the last war that some of the Hawks are still fighting in their own minds.
You just sort of stole my follow-up question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay, because the one thing the Hawks have going for them is that they're very much in favor of that military spending that ensures that we maybe won't get into the next conflict because we're so well equipped. We have to have the greatest fighting force on the planet. You've said that. So how do we ensure that the American people are in support of the military spending required to make sure that we don't have to use it?
The more transparency, number one, there is in our military spending, to the extent there can be, right? We're not talking about sharing classified data that needs to remain classified. The greater sense that the current administration, which it has started, is actually doing a reform of the procurement process at the Pentagon, which is grossly outdated and really focuses on the almost monopoly that 2 or 3 big military contractors have. We want those contractors to continue to be part of it. We just want there to be some variety and diversity in the contracts. But then the third thing is, when it comes to the people's house, the United States Capitol, when there are issues, when there are bills that are coming up for military spending, there ought to be real debates. I mean, even including among Republicans, hopefully collegial and civil and all of that, that explains the following. Connect the dots between spending hundreds of billions of dollars on that plane or that submarine to the grand geopolitical strategy that the United States has. That's what Trump does in spades. And I think that the longer, not just Trump, but maybe Trump-aligned people are in office at every level, the better we will get at this. There will be a place for more hawkish members in the conservative movement. I don't really have a problem with that, provided debates they have with Heritage are on the substance and, not sort of silly.
Yeah.
But the reason there's room for that is because ultimately they will realize that you can't go to war in all of those places. You're going to have to prioritize. So at Heritage, my national security colleagues say, they're neither hawks nor doves. They're owls, wise enough to know when to engage.
Wow. All right. That was starting to get a little foul. So let's move on from all the bird analogies, although it does open up a very, very big topic, and that is America's military readiness. And it's such a big topic that we're going to save it for our next episode. We're all done with this one. But next week, we're going to talk about America's military readiness and Heritage and their very own military readiness index. How are we making the grade right now, and are we ready for that next conflict, should, God forbid, it come? We'll talk about it. In the meantime, subscribe, give us some likes, and even more importantly, give us some comments. We want to know what you think, your feedback, and some questions. Your question might appear on a future episode. Thanks for watching The Kevin Roberts Show.